I still remember the first time I heard her name, Zuri. It means beautiful in Swahili. And that she was. Even through the haze of pain and fear clouding her amber eyes, the first photo I saw of her, forwarded by the Wildlife Center, gripped something deep in me. I'd seen many animals come through the zoo, each with its own story, but Zuri's was different from the beginning. The call came from a rescue team operating near the southeastern border of Kenya, close to Tsavo National Park. They had found an adult female cheetah lying under a patch of scrub, barely conscious. She had deep gashes on her flank and a wound on her right hind leg, likely from a snare trap, the kind poachers set to catch bushmeat. But cheetahs aren't the intended prey of these traps, they're just the collateral damage in a growing war for survival. Zuri had been reported by a group of local rangers after hearing distress calls near a waterhole, not far from a known poaching route. By the time the rangers reached her, it was clear she wouldn't last much longer without help. She was thin, ribs showing even under her spotted coat, and dehydrated. The snare had cut off circulation for too long, and the leg was swollen, infected, and oozing. She must have lain there for at least 2 days before anyone found her. In the wild, that kind of vulnerability usually meant the end. But somehow, Zuri had held on. She was taken to a wildlife rehabilitation center in Nairobi, where the veterinary team worked around the clock to stabilize her. I learned later that they weren't sure she'd pull through. The infection had spread, and they were considering amputation. But Zuri fought with a quiet resilience that impressed everyone. She responded to antibiotics, slowly began to eat again, and within 2 weeks, her condition improved enough for them to consider long-term recovery options. That's when we were contacted. Our zoo, part of a global network of conservation centers, had a reputation for successfully integrating large cats rescued from the wild, including those unfit to return. We had open-range enclosures, medical staff trained in wildlife trauma, and perhaps most important, an accredited cheetah breeding program. If Zuri couldn't survive in the wild anymore, we could at least give her a meaningful life and maybe, just maybe, a second chance to help her species survive. I'd been volunteering at the zoo for 5 years by then, working mostly with big cats, and was one of the few trained to help in post-rescue acclimatization. I was there the morning Zuri arrived. She came in a specially designed transport crate, flown from Nairobi to Amsterdam, then driven across the country in a van modified for medical transport. She was still recovering, her leg wrapped, her movement cautious. I remember standing beside the crate when they opened the door. She didn't bolt out. Instead, she slowly stepped forward, her body low, tail twitching slightly. Her coat was duller than I'd expected, but her eyes, those eyes, were alert, wary, intelligent. The first few weeks were delicate. We had to earn her trust, and it couldn't be rushed. She was housed in our quarantine and recovery enclosure, a quiet area set apart from the rest of the zoo. Every day, I sat outside her enclosure, sometimes for hours, just reading aloud or talking softly. I brought her food but kept my distance. If she came closer, I didn't move. It was all about letting her set the pace. Her recovery wasn't just physical. Zuri had seen humans at their worst, and I could tell she didn't differentiate between poachers and caretakers yet. The sight of a man in boots made her freeze. The sound of a gate opening made her flinch. It took almost a month before she stopped pacing at night and lay down to sleep without watching the door. One morning, as I entered the observation area, I noticed something different. Zuri was sitting by the mesh, watching me. Not just glancing, watching. Her ears weren't flattened. Her posture was calm. I knelt down, quietly, and began reading like I always did. That morning, she stayed the entire time. That was the day I knew we had crossed a threshold. Zuri's leg healed better than we expected. The vet team had managed to avoid amputation, though she would always have a slight limp and reduced strength in that limb. She would never chase antelope across the savannah again, but she could run short distances and leap with more grace than any other animal we had. Over the next few months, she was moved to a larger transitional enclosure. We introduced her to simulated hunts, dragging food on a pulley to encourage stalking behavior. Her instincts were intact. She crouched low, tail swaying, and eyes locked on the target. Even with her injury, she moved like silk across the grass. But what struck me most was her personality. Zuri wasn't aggressive, but she wasn't passive either. She was independent, sharp, and observant. She didn't play like some of our other cats. She watched. She assessed. And once she understood her environment, she adapted swiftly. That intelligence made her a prime candidate for our breeding program. Before any introductions could happen, though, we needed to ensure Zuri was fully prepared. Socialization is complex with cheetahs. Unlike lions, they're not pack animals, and females especially tend to be solitary. Introducing her to potential mates would have to be gradual and carefully monitored. We had 2 males in the program, Kano and Tariq, both born in captivity, both healthy and genetically valuable. But before we could even think of that next step, we had to be sure Zuri was comfortable enough to accept companionship at all. There was one moment, quiet and small, that told me she might be ready. It was late afternoon, and I was cleaning the outer fence when I noticed her watching a group of children on a school tour. They were laughing, pointing, utterly fascinated. Zuri didn't hide. She didn't move away. She stayed near the viewing glass, ears flicking occasionally, tail curled loosely. A calmness in her I hadn't seen before. I whispered her name, Zuri. She turned her head slightly, looked at me, and blinked, slow and deliberate. In animal behavior, especially with cats, that kind of blink is often a sign of trust. It was time to take the next step. Introducing a cheetah to another is a slow, deliberate process. In the wild, adult females like Zuri typically live alone unless they're raising cubs. Males sometimes form coalitions, usually with siblings, but females only seek out company for mating. So we knew that even though Zuri had grown stronger, physically and emotionally, introducing her to another cheetah would be a delicate operation. And in her case, especially so. The breeding program had 2 males as potential partners, Kano and Tariq. Both were around 5 years old, well into their prime. Kano was confident and assertive, raised in a group with other cheetahs before eventually being paired off. Tariq, on the other hand, was more cautious, more attuned to subtle cues. If Zuri were to accept either of them, we had to match more than just genetics. Personality and chemistry mattered, and for a female that had survived the trauma of the wild and injury, we needed to tread carefully. We started the process with scent introductions. For 2 weeks, we rotated bedding, rubbing logs and surfaces from Zuri's enclosure with Tariq's scent, and vice versa. The goal was to let them get used to each other without direct contact. Zuri sniffed the logs thoroughly but didn't show signs of distress. More than that, she began marking areas in response. That was a good sign. It meant she was engaged. When the time came for a visual introduction, we used a split enclosure, 2 adjoining spaces with a mesh wall in between. Zuri was led into one side, and Tariq was released into the other. I stood watching from the observation deck with Dr. Becker, our lead zoologist. Zuri paced at first, her tail twitching. Tariq walked up to the fence, calm but curious. He chirped softly, a high-pitched vocalization cheetahs use to signal non-aggression. Zuri stopped pacing. She turned toward the mesh and looked at him. Then she did something unexpected. She lay down near the fence. That's promising, Dr. Becker whispered beside me. She's not posturing. We gave them 10 minutes together, no more. Each day, we increased the time. They began mirroring each other's movements. When one walked, so did the other. When Tariq drank water, Zuri would approach her own bowl. No growling, no defensive signals. Still, we were careful. No amount of caution is too much when you're dealing with big cats. After 3 weeks, we opened the gate between them under supervision. The first in-person meeting was tense but uneventful. Zuri approached slowly, tail low. Tariq stood still, allowing her to circle. Then she batted at him, lightly, not aggressive, more like a test. He chirped again and moved away. That, I realized, was the breakthrough. From that point on, they began spending more time together. Not always close, often just sharing the same space without interaction, but peaceably. And for cheetahs, that's as good as it gets. What stood out most during those weeks wasn't their chemistry, though. It was Zuri herself. She had grown into a new version of the cheetah we'd first met. Stronger, steadier, she had muscle tone again. Her coat was glossy, her eyes bright. The limp was still there, but it no longer defined her. She would even sprint short distances during enrichment activities, leaping for hanging meat or chasing toys dragged on wires. She was a predator again. One day, I entered the behind-the-scenes area during feeding, and she didn't back away. She approached the fence as I crouched to slide her bowl through. She was 2 feet from me, separated only by wire. I whispered her name, and for the second time since she arrived, she blinked slowly. That night, I sat in the volunteer break room scrolling through old photos. I found the first one, Zuri lying limp in a rescue stretcher, ribs protruding, eyes clouded with pain. I compared it with a shot I'd taken that afternoon, her standing tall beside Tariq, looking like she'd never been anywhere but the savannah. It was almost time. Breeding attempts began in late March. Our zoological team monitored her cycle closely, waiting for signs that she was receptive. It took several weeks. There were setbacks. Zuri would grow irritable, sometimes swat at Tariq if he got too close. That was natural. Even in the wild, mating can be as much about boundaries as connection. But then came a stretch of days where she sought him out, rubbing against the same tree he had marked, staying closer than usual. The team decided it was time. They were allowed full unsupervised access over a 48-hour period, with remote cameras tracking every move. And though we never interfere in these moments, the entire zoo staff held its collective breath. Zuri had come so far, we just hoped she trusted enough now to take this next step. What happened next felt like a miracle. Not only did she mate with Tariq, but her behavior changed noticeably in the weeks that followed. She became more protective of her space, vocalized more often, and began choosing shaded dens over open spaces. These were all signs. Ultrasound a month later confirmed it. Zuri was pregnant. I was in the clinic when Dr. Becker announced the results. 2, possibly 3 cubs, he said. She did it. The room erupted in cheers. But even then, we prepared for complications. Cheetah cubs born in captivity are vulnerable, just as they are in the wild. Mortality rates are high, and Zuri's injury history added further risk. We began around-the-clock preparations, installing cameras in the birthing den, training additional keepers, consulting other zoos about supportive protocols. Zuri gave birth on a cool morning in July, in the quietest corner of the cheetah enclosure. She chose a shaded, brush-covered den and labored silently, instinctively. The cameras captured the moment. First one cub, then another, then a third. All alive, all moving. It was rare and beautiful. Zuri proved to be an attentive, gentle mother. She licked the cubs clean, kept them tucked close. When keepers came for quick checks, she stood nearby, watching but not interfering. It was as if she understood. She knew these humans, knew they meant her no harm. For the next 6 weeks, the cubs stayed hidden from public view. We monitored their health, tracked Zuri's feeding, and waited. She was remarkably calm, especially for a first-time mother. When the cubs finally emerged, small, wobbly, with dark mantles running down their backs, the entire staff gathered behind the viewing glass. I stood there too, watching Zuri guide them into the sun. She looked nothing like the animal we had received almost a year ago. She was complete. It's been several years since the day Zuri first stepped into her enclosure, and yet, even now, I find myself returning to that moment. When she blinked at me through the wire, her body still thin and healing, but her spirit unbroken. At the time, I didn't realize how far-reaching her story would become, how much one rescued cheetah could shape lives, both animal and human. Zuri raised her first litter with the kind of quiet strength that had become her signature. The 3 cubs, 2 males and 1 female, thrived under her care. She was firm but gentle, watchful but never anxious. Our team kept a respectful distance, letting her instincts guide the process. Cheetah mothers are notoriously private, especially in captivity, but Zuri adapted better than any of us predicted. The cubs grew fast. By 3 months, they were chasing each other through the grass, leaping on low branches, testing boundaries. At 6 months, they were introduced to new sounds, new surfaces, rubber mats, logs, even recordings of wild prey calls, to help stimulate their senses. We wanted them to develop with as much natural behavior as possible. Zuri, ever the sentinel, was never far. What touched me most wasn't just how she cared for her cubs, but how her story began to spread. Local media first picked up the news, rescued cheetah becomes mother to rare cubs in captivity. Then came national wildlife journals, conservation blogs, even a short documentary segment. Her survival, and more than that, her transformation, offered a kind of hope people seemed hungry for. In a world where human impact often means devastation for wildlife, here was a case where intervention had led to new life. And still, she remained the same composed, focused creature we had come to know. Even with the attention, the cameras, the influx of new faces, Zuri never faltered. She stood watch at the edges of the enclosure while her cubs played, always attentive, always aware. Never once did she act out or show distress. After year, decisions had to be made. Her cubs, now sub-adults, would soon need more space and purpose. For male cheetahs, the next step was easier. They would eventually join our coalition group, trained and conditioned for possible transfer to other accredited zoos as part of global breeding plans. But the female, whom we named Amani, meaning peace in Swahili, was different. Genetically, Amani was especially valuable, part wild, part captive bred. But more importantly, her calm disposition and confidence mirrored her mother's. The board proposed a long-term breeding plan for Amani, one that could include reintroduction into a managed wild reserve in southern Africa. This would be one of the first steps in a broader rewilding program the zoo had recently partnered with. But it would require extensive behavioral testing and months of preparation. It was a bold idea. Reintroducing cheetahs isn't common, and many fail to adapt. But Amani had a unique profile, healthy, intelligent, and born to a mother who had lived the wild life, even if only for part of her own. Zuri's legacy was about to expand again. She remained a cornerstone of the breeding program for another few years. She was introduced to Kano eventually as well, and while they never bonded the way she had with Tariq, she tolerated him, and that, in cheetah terms, is as good as cooperation gets. She had one more litter, 2 males, who both went on to thrive in breeding partnerships across Europe. And then, as with all animals, time began to catch up. Her injured leg, long-healed, began to stiffen with age. Her coat thinned slightly, and the long sprints gave way to dignified strolls. The veterinary team began adding supplements to her diet, built raised platforms to ease her movement, and kept her environment enriched but calm. I visited her often, more out of habit than necessity. She didn't need me anymore, but she always seemed to know when I was there. She would sit beneath her favorite tree, front legs tucked neatly, and watch the cubs, her own and others, roaming the grassy enclosure. Sometimes she'd flick her tail lazily in the dust, eyes following the wind, ears twitching to every sound. Watching her then, I used to think, this is what survival can look like when compassion intervenes. When she passed, it was quiet and peaceful. She was 12, an old age for a cheetah, especially one with her history. The vet said her heart simply gave out one morning. I was there an hour later. The keepers had laid flowers around her favorite tree, and one of the staff had placed a photo of her with her first cubs nearby. There were tears. Even the hardest of us, keepers who seen births and deaths many times over, stood silent longer than usual that day. But here's the truth, Zuri didn't just survive. She changed the trajectory of our program. She proved that animals with trauma can not only recover but thrive. Her cubs, and their cubs, live on in zoos and reserves across Europe and southern Africa. Amani, in particular, became part of a pilot rewilding program in Namibia, living in a protected reserve where, last I heard, she'd raised a litter of her own. Zuri's DNA runs in every one of them. But her story, her resilience, runs even deeper, in the hearts of every volunteer, every child who visited her, every person who read her story and felt a flicker of belief that maybe, just maybe, humanity can undo some of its damage. And for me? Well, I still volunteer. I still tell her story on guided tours when kids point and ask, who was that cheetah in the picture by the tree? I tell them she was called Zuri. She was beautiful, and she mattered.